Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. I was recently reading a tweet from someone who I don't think really knows type theory, but, is familiar with the concept of introversion and extraversion, which is in the public consciousness. So it's unsurprising that people talk about introversion and extraversion. And lots of different systems, personality type systems, refer to this. Not just Myers-Briggs, the Big Five does as well. And they were mentioning their tweet. It was really charming and sad at the same time. Their tweet, I don't think they had any idea that they were about to run into what I call the wave of the intranet or the introvert revolution.
Yeah.
They said, one of the advantages, even just remembering the tweet, it was so sweet and simple and so naive. I'm like, oh, you sweet summer child. They said, one of the advantages to being an extrovert is that extroverts can have all these really amazing creative ideas that come to them through conversation. And so they have a real advantage when they're talking to other people and being able to come up with these new ideas.
By the way, you're saying it wasn't sweet, like dismissive of what they were saying. You're saying the naivety is how the backlash they were going to get for this, not for their uncalibration in what they're saying.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, no, they had no idea what was coming for them because they're not in the type world. So they don't know that anytime you say the two phrases extrovert and advantage together, that the Huns will be at the gate. So, of course, there had to have been 30 to 50 tweets underneath responding with how extroverts don't really come up with creative ideas, that they're not very that they don't think that, that introverts are so much better at thinking because they can do it by themselves. And it was just this major backlash against this really sweet little tweet about, hey, extroverts have some advantages too. Now, of course, the reason why is because the assumption is that extroverts have nothing but advantages. So if you're going to now start claiming an introvert advantage, which is being thoughtful, well, now you're on their turf. And I'm not sure why introverts felt complete and total permission to talk so much crap about extroverts, saying things like they don't think at all. And of course, as an ENTP, I'm reading this, I'm like, why must we always create divisions and lines in the sand and do an us versus them and state our superiority? But of course, the reason why is because introverts have felt like they've been disadvantaged. They live in what they believe is an extrovert's world. And so, of course, anytime you can claim stake for yourself, right? Like claim territory, we're the thoughtful ones, then you don't want anybody getting in on your turf.
Yeah, I think to empathize with introverts and the feelings that it must be like to go through a world that rewards so much outer behavior, so much extroverted behavior, and the metrics are extroverted, the syncing up to the outer world is extra. Like there's so much that's required of us in our world. Like go fast pace, don't slow down, don't be mindful about things, just act. And I think that's really troubling to somebody that wants to slow down, that's naturally wired as an introvert to just take time, spend time to make the right decisions, or however it works for an introvert, however you people do this stuff. I'm kind of kidding, but I can see why it's such a feeling of like, guys, can we have our space, our turf, something that we can feel really good about being an introvert? And then in the last 10 years, there's been this, I wouldn't call it an uprising, but definitely a movement of introverts to say, hey, wait a second, the whole world's set up for these extrovert people, but what about us? We have a lot of advantages. In fact, there was this book that came out called The Introvert Advantage. We recorded an entire podcast on it a few years ago. And I think that there's this notion that introverts have a lot to bring to the world. And in fact, they do. They do have a lot to bring to the world. They don't have to be extroverted to bring value to society at all.
Mm. Yeah, and I feel like we have definitely here at Personality Hacker made sure that we acknowledge that there are some real struggles to having introverted preferences and that there are some major advantages to it. And I think we should throw a little love the other direction too, because while there are elements to living in this world that having extroverted preferences do grease the wheels a bit, there are definitely advantages to being naturally an extrovert. I don't think extroverts are necessarily the bad guy, right? Just because the world is more tailored to an extroverted preference or an extroverted attitude, that's how, of course, how we interface with the rest of the world. Because there are some advantages to being naturally wired that way, I don't think it means that we have to dogpile extroverts. And so I thought what we would do in this particular podcast is talk about the advantages of each, right? Both people who have introverted preferences and people who have extroverted preferences. There's advantages to both sides. There's costs to both sides. And there's a reason to celebrate what you are on both sides. There's also a need to be aware of the disadvantages. There are elements to being an introvert that are a disadvantage that go beyond, by the way, I just want more alone time than people give me. Like, there are other disadvantages. And there are disadvantages to being an extrovert, and there's a lot of them. And so that all has to be taken into consideration when you're looking at how you're wired and how you're going to navigate through the world. What are you smiling about?
I prefer to say they're challenges rather than disadvantages.
Okay. All right, that's the happier way of saying
it's
it.
The more empowering way to see it. Like, oh, these are challenging aspects of who I am as an extrovert.
All right, fair enough. There's challenges to being an introvert and to being an extrovert. So let's define our terms quickly. What is an introvert and what is an extrovert? Well, if you've been around Personality Hacker long enough, you may know that we have described this, and actually the way that we describe it can sometimes be a challenging way. So maybe we should address that as well. Most of the time when you're looking at definitions of introversion and extroversion, they talk about things like our behaviors and our sort of our modalities for living life. Like, introverts don't like people as much and extroverts like people, which we think is a gross oversimplification. But there's also elements like how you get your energy. For introverts, you're going to get your energy by being able to carve out some alone time. And for extroverts, you're going to get energy by being in the outside world. Now, again, a lot of times these get distilled down to socializing, like whether or not you like people. And unfortunately, that kind of description has caused some mistypes, because there are plenty of extroverted types out there who are not particularly fond of people. And so if you always associate introversion and extroversion with being social or liking people, then it actually might throw you off.
Well, and we are social creatures. Humans are social creatures. So the measurement of sociability makes sense, because that's how so many of us are wired to tap into other humans, right? We're so socially focused as a species that this one slice, this one lens gets overvalued in how we see introversion or extroversion.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Jonathan Haidt calls us 90% ape, 10% bee. Well, there's a part of us that are part of what is effectively like an Ansible, that we're connected with every other person. And there are introvert types, people who have introvert preferences that love human beings. They love being around other people, and they're seeking socializing all the time. Not all the time, but they seek socializing on a regular basis because they really enjoy and love being around people. Now, whether or not they can do that sustainably for an extended amount of time, whether or not they need plenty of alone time to go recharge, that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that when they're around people, it's a very rewarding experience for them. Now, there are some extrovert types that it's the opposite. They are, they're able to interface with the outside world on a regular basis and don't need as much alone time. But when they're around people drive them crazy, right? They don't like small talk. They don't like having to play nicey nice. They don't understand what the purpose of just connecting with other people for the sake of connecting is. And so a lot of these people end up believing that they're introverts because of the gross oversimplification of associating introversion, extroversion with socializing. So in order to get beyond that challenge, we say for introverts, the inner world is the real world, and for extroverts, the outer world is the real world. Now, this also can be a little misleading, because there are certain types, and I've had sensory types ask me, well, I'm a concrete thinker, so wouldn't I think that the outer world is the real world? And to an intuitive, that wouldn't be the case, right? Isn't that more of an intuition and sensing challenge, or not challenge, but difference? And by real world, we don't mean the world of reality. We mean the world that you as a subjective individual check in with first to determine whether or not, or to find the information that fuels you. So for extroverts, and you and I are both have extroverted preferences, Joel. So I'm gonna, whenever I say extrovert, I'm gonna say us, right? Me, us.
We're taking sides now.
Right.
Throw down. Here we go.
That's right. Against all you introverts. No, I'm just gonna refer to.
I know what you're doing.
Us will be extroverts. The other guy will be the introverts. All right. So those of us that have extroverted preferences, when we are seeking stimuli, when we're seeking something to feed us, when we need a trigger for a good idea or for an experience, we look to the outer world. The outer world is the world that's going to fuel us, and it doesn't have to necessarily be people.
Yeah, when we're low energy, we need a spark of something. It's often the outer world I'm focused on.
Right. The world of our preference is the world of reconciliation. When I am trying to figure out how I feel about something, what I think about it, when I'm trying to reconcile ideas, I have an instinct to go gather more information in the outside world, to talk to people, to have experiences, to go live it for myself. And once I've lived it for myself or had conversations about this thing, now I take all of that information and then based on my type preferences, then I go ruminate on it and figure out what my personal, like what do I think about that?
Well, if you're balanced and healthy, you're doing that. I mean, you can become one-sided and only look at the outside world in a lot of ways and just get so one-sided in this, you don't check in with your inner space as an extrovert.
You got it. Absolutely. And so that's the ideal. The ideal is that for extroverted types, we go seek more information in the outside world to reconcile what we already think or feel or what's going on internally. For a perceiver type, so if we're extroverts that are perceivers, so all four of the EPs, then that means that we're trying to suss out, just mentioned what's logical to me or what makes sense to me. For you, Joel, as a FP, that would be more like how you feel about things and what's in alignment for you. But we're seeking experiences in the outside world and conversations that we gather those pieces of information up, and then inside we start to put them in terms of prioritization. What makes the most sense to me? What do I think is a leverage point? What strikes me as being important? What are my values? What are my intentions and motivations? What are my beliefs, right? We're all trying to figure that out internally, but we don't know those things yet until we've had more experiences and conversations in the outside world.
And the risk is we'll value what's out there more than what's in here. I mean, that's really the risk. Even though you're going in to try to ruminate and figure things out, I'm still on that reconciliation or syncing up chart. I always think, well, what's out there happening? I need to sync up to that outside of myself.
Right. And the leverage point is when we realize, oh, I actually can have my own thing going on. I can determine that for myself first and then move through the world without syncing up with the outside world. I can actually ask the outside world to sync up with me. That's a game-changing thought for EP types. Then for extroverts that are judgers, right, so the EJ, the 4 EJ types, there's a sense of creativity that happens internally, right? There's a sense of rumination and what's happening inside based on maybe projections into the future or where we've seen this in the past. But the reality happens when an extrovert judger sees it working in the outside world in terms of systems and people. Meaning that if this doesn't have a practical value to it, if it doesn't have something that I can observe works in the outside world in either the projects and systems I'm setting up or in my human interactions and relationships and influencing culture, then it doesn't matter, right? Like that's the ultimate arbiter of what's important, is that it's working in the outside world. And so the reconciliation, the check-in happens externally for all 8 of the extrovert types. The outside world is the final arbiter of where information is found or how things work. And once I sync up to that, then I know that I'm on more solid footing, and then I can do my internal rumination or my internal figuring out and then bring those elements to the outside world. But it's always an outside world reference. Like whatever I'm figuring out for myself, I immediately want to talk about it to other people. Whatever's happening internally for most extroverts, they want to bring it to the outside world because that's like sort of the final port of call. And so the important thing is to remember, no, you got to carve out some time for yourself. You've got to go do that inner world rumination. Otherwise, you're not going to have a complete picture. For introverts, the reconciliation happens the other direction. It's always taking whatever's taken from the outside world. Just like I mentioned, for those of us who are extroverts, we sort of try to figure out like what means something to us as individuals. Well, that's a natural talent, and it's the natural direction introverts go. They're naturally given to first figuring out what's happening with them internally. And they have to be reminded a lot of times to go to the outside world to get more of that information, because the idea of just being able to be a complete closed system is very attractive to a lot of introverts. Like, I don't really need to go in the outside world to go get more information. I can just kind of figure things out on my own, having observed it from a distance. And so that reconciliation process, and actually I would argue now sort of scientifically backed, that introverts are more given to believing that the inner world is the real world. Because whenever you go through any sort of learning process or take in information, if you look at an extrovert's mind versus an introvert's, and we did a podcast on this many years ago, for an introvert, there's like 3 more tracks that they have to go through neurologically. Like, it doesn't just go, oh, that's the outside world's information, bunk, now I've got it, like an extrovert would. They have to like kind of go through a couple different neurological superhighways to be able to determine whether or not this information is something that they actually want to take in-house. So if you're protective of your inner world, if you have to go through multiple reconciliation processes in order to absorb a piece of information from the outside, that means the inner world is the real world in terms of protection, in terms of making sure that whatever comes inside actually does track with how you feel about it, what you think about it, what's going on for you, because that's the protected world of reality. You don't want to mess that up with corrupted information.
So we could say that the reconciliation for an introvert happens internally. The ledger you're reconciling against is an internal ledger. And you often start there with that reconciliation process, where for the extrovert, the outer world is where that reconciliation happens. And this is what we mean by the real world.
Right, exactly. Now, all of that can be highly confusing to a person, because a lot of people will say, well, I do both of those things. Accurate. You do both of those things.
Yeah.
Every human being does. And in terms of type theory, if you look at it through the lens of cognitive functions, like the Jungian cognitive functions, our dominant, or in the car model, our driver cognitive function is going to be introverted or extroverted. And then our secondary auxiliary, or what we call the co-pilot function, will be the opposite. So the technical names for this are attitudes, extroverted or introverted attitudes. And each of us have both of them. And we have to have both to be able to get inside of ourselves and know how we feel about things and what means something to us. And we need to be able to interface with the outside world. So if we don't have access to both of these channels, we're not a complete person. We're either only input or only output, and neither of those are ideal. So we all have an extroverted part of us, and we all have an introverted part. And when we describe it the way that we describe it, Joel, sometimes it gets kind of confusing to people because they're looking for silver bullets. They're looking for a list of qualities or characteristics or traits that are consistent amongst all extroverts and consistent amongst all introverts. And the problem is that these are trends, not rules. So you can be an introvert that loves people, goes and seeks them out, it really enjoys being around other people, and doesn't realize that you've been oversaturated with them until you get home and go, oh my gosh, I got to crash now, because you enjoyed being in the experience of being around other people. There are people who have introverted preferences that believe they're extroverts because of this, because of the character trait list of wanting to be alone, not wanting to go to parties, wanting to hang out all by yourself, being a cat person or whatever, right? Like there's these
being a cat person
stereotype lists that people are trying to match themselves up with, and they go, oh, well, clearly I'm an introvert because I prefer to be at home thinking by myself, or clearly I'm an extrovert because I love to be around people. And unfortunately, even though these are trends, because they're not rules and because humans are complex, there's a lot of mistypes out there. So yeah, we do explain introversion and extroversion in a different way than other people do, and in a more complex way, because we're actually trying to signal this is a complex subject. This isn't this is not cut and dry, and all of us have both parts. So which is the side that we prefer? And oftentimes, the easiest way to determine that is which is the thing that you have a compulsion towards. So you might love to hang out with people, you might love to go travel and have outer world experiences, and then you are compelled to spend large amounts of time by yourself. If you don't get that high quality alone time on a regular basis, and by regular basis, I mean like daily, and if at all possible, minimum an hour, but more than that, if you don't get that time, then you lose touch with who you are. Now, an extrovert might feel the exact same way, by the way. I'm a person who needs a lot of alone time for thinking, but I'm not compelled to do that. It's something I've learned to do and have been so rewarded for doing it, I now seek it out. But it's sort of like I learned how to love the flavor of salad because my body knows I'm about to get nutrient-rich foods inside of me. And because I've trained myself to love salad, and because my body wants those nutrients, it craves them, and I'll go eat salads. But before I had taught myself to eat nutrient-dense foods, I never craved salad. I only ever wanted things that tasted good. And so for an extrovert, you may have trained yourself to have this quality alone time, and your mind went, oh, that's nutrient dense. I like that. I need more of that. But it didn't start out that way. It started out by being able to be extroverted all the time. You had to train yourself to understand this. And the reverse is also true. When you are an introvert, you might have trained yourself to realize that when you go into the outside world and interface with it, lots of good stuff happens. You get things done, you leave an imprint on the world, you have an impact, you see things like sort of opening up for you, you feel a lot more rich and like you're exploring this other side of you. And so that's your salad, that's your nutrient-dense foods. And as an introvert, you might crave that. You might go, you know what, that's really healthy for me to do. I'm going to go do that more. But given, if everything else was equal and you hadn't trained yourself into that, your tendency would be to spend all your time alone. That would be your preference, if at all possible, if you hadn't experienced the richness of going to the other side.
Just to reiterate, some of the complexity or the challenge in understanding this is because the dichotomy of being an introvert or an extrovert, like you're one or the other, in some ways is an oversimplification of what's actually happening for you. When I say that, what I mean is, like Antonia mentioned, there's an introverted part of all of us, and there's an extroverted part of all of us. And so someone that's new to personality type understands that about themselves. They're like, I feel like I've got both parts of me. And they might say something like, I think I'm an ambivert. I think I'm both an extrovert and an introvert. I don't feel like I fall on one side or the other. And that's correct. Like if you look at the cognitive functions, the wiring of our mind, we are ambiverts. We can tap into both of those sides, like Antonia mentioned. And so when we talk about being an extrovert or an introvert, we're basically saying that our preference is to lead with that, what's technically called the attitude of introversion or extroversion at the cognitive wiring of our mind level. So the cognitive function that we lead with has that as an attitude. As an example, my personality type is ENFP preferences in the Myers-Briggs system. So I have ENFP preferences. That means I'm an extrovert. That means the cognitive function is my driver, or technically called the dominant cognitive function, is an extroverted cognitive function. It's an extroverted attitude. So that's why I'm considered an extrovert. But there's my co-pilot or auxiliary cognitive function, which is introverted feeling for me. And that is an introverted attitude. So I have both parts of these. It's not that I'm fully one-sided extrovert. I have an ambivert nature to me. We've recorded an entire podcast about the ambivert personality type and what that means and really unpack this in a lot of ways. This was a few years ago. You can go search for that podcast. I think it's a really great listen because we talk about that. But just to understand that that's why we go into the cognitive functions, because the complexity that lays there really explains how we show up as people. And we can start to see, okay, that's why I identify with both of these aspects. And then the other thing is we're looking to grow the opposite side of the attitude that we're naturally inclined towards. So me, again, as an extrovert, I'm going to naturally default to extraversion. And I'm going to potentially, if I don't pay attention to what's going on, I'm going to bypass the introverted part of me as much as I can get away with. I'm going to look to the outside world. I'm going to try to bypass that and only pull on my extroverted, focused cognitive functions. Well, we know that if I can focus on the inner space, I can get, like Antonia said, that salad. I can start to grow myself and start to round out my personality. I can bring in more of those introverted aspects into my life. And if you flip it, if you're an introvert, same thing. There's a tendency to bypass the extroverted part of yourself and just stay in the introverted world. And you can get one-sided, lopsided in that way. And the goal is to grow the extroverted part of yourself. It doesn't mean you become an extrovert. It doesn't mean you have to become this social butterfly people person. But it does mean to, in whatever way you're wired, stretch the extroverted part of yourself and grow that. And that's going to round you out as a person and give you more access to all parts of who you are.
Yeah, I think I think that idea that we all actually want to be ambiverts. That's the goal. It's not possible in the sense of like type theory, in the sense that we will always have a dominant or driver cognitive function that is our most preferred function. We're never going to stop that. No matter how much we develop that auxiliary or co-pilot function, that dominant is still going to take highest precedent for us. So in technical terms, we never are true ambiverts in the sense of like cognitive wiring or type dynamics. But we want to be as close to it as possible. Yeah, we want to really be developing that other side of ourselves because that's how we balance ourselves out. That's how we have access to as much information as possible, as much world as possible. And so this idea of what is real and what isn't, the more we develop that auxiliary or co-pilot, the more real that world becomes to us because we have visited it so much. We understand that there's really no difference between our inner and outer world. We start to become sort of like unity mind people where we're like, it's actually the same thing. So if you get far enough down your development, then it's hard to understand the difference between, well, what do you mean by real world and not real world? Well, we're not saying necessarily that the other attitudinal world isn't real. Like for me, I'm an extrovert, but my inner world is very real to me. I feel the most real when I'm in my extroverted intuition or exploration, though. That's my dominant or driver with the ENTP preferences. That's when I feel the most real as myself. I feel the most myself. I feel the most in control. I feel the highest amount of certainty. I feel like I'm in my space. I'm in my flow. And so that is the most real experience I personally have. I've talked to people who have ISJ preferences. So that would mean that their dominant or driver function is introverted sensing or memory. That's their preferred style of introversion. And when they review things from the past, that feels the most real to them. That feels like when they're reviewing something that they've experienced, that is them experiencing something that feels the most tangible, interestingly enough, even though it's like internal for them. So it's this space that we enter where everything feels like it's clicking. Everything feels like it's aligned. But if you just look at it in terms of introversion and extroversion, it's much harder to see that because regardless of whether or not we're going inside or outside, both worlds will pull us into spaces that don't feel as real. So take, for example, I am an extrovert. I have a preference for extroverted intuition, that cognitive function, or what we call exploration. But when I interface with the outside world, it doesn't let me be in that space all the time. It has other demands for me. It might require me to be in a get things done mode. Well, get things done is usually more associated with the cognitive function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness. This is not my preferred space to be when I'm in the outside world. I want to be in my intuition. I don't want to be in my extroverted thinking. So when the world demands it of me, all of a sudden things aren't as quote unquote real to me. They aren't always, I don't feel like the wheels are greased and I'm in my space and I'm in my flow, etc. I'm like struggling and I don't really like it very much and I want to get out of it as fast as possible. And that's me interfacing with the outside world, but it's not me interfacing with a world that feels quote unquote more real. It's me trying to get away from this thing that I think is actually in some ways for me an unreality. So it's not all extroverted experiences will be real. It's that when I'm in my preferred extroverted space, that feels the most real to me. And the same thing happens the other direction with introversion. When a person's an introvert, when they go inside, I think there's a little bit more control actually internally to stay in one's preferred introverted space. But that's not always the case. There might be things inside that are requiring attention. Maybe you have some, emotional trauma you've got to work out. And every time you go inside, that's jerking the wheel, right? It's going, hey, I've got unprocessed trauma. Come please attend to me. And so when one goes inside, they might also be taken out of their wheelhouse. They might be exploring internal spaces that are not their preferred areas to go to. And in that moment, it's not going to feel, quote unquote, the most real. It's going to feel like a place they want to escape and get away from. So it's not that the entire inner world is more real to an introvert and the entire outer world is more real for an extrovert. It's that the most real territory you're going to experience is going to be in that dominant or driver function, which carves out a space in that external or internal world, right? Like my most real territory for me lives in the outer space, extroverted intuition. For an introvert, the most real territory is going to be found in their inner terrain, whatever that dominant preference is.
And so that's a really important distinction, again, just to pay attention to what Antonia just said. The dominant function is more of the real world than even just the introverted or extroverted space. It's the flavoring of the introverted space, or it's the flavoring of the extroverted space, right? So an ETJ leading with the cognitive function of extroverted thinking or effectiveness activities, doing extroverted thinking things in the outer world is going to be more of the real world than, let's say, extroverted intuition, which would be my preferred dominant function. So it's not just the external world is the more real world for an ETJ. It would be the extroverted thinking cognitive function world is the most real world for an ETJ. Let's say an INFJ, introverted intuition or perspectives, is the dominant cognitive function. So when there's introverted intuitive things happening inside, that's going to be the most real world for them, way more than maybe, let's say, introverted feeling or authenticity. That's not going to be as real as the dominant cognitive function. So you see how the complexities start to layer on as we bring the functions in here, not just introversion or extroversion. Now we're starting to see qualitative nature to the introversion or extroversion. We're starting to see a nuance to it. And so that's something also to consider as you think about how you're wired, how you're showing up to the world, which world is the real world to you. We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show.
These complexities get layered on top. I think that actually ends up giving people who are not fans of type theory space to criticize. But for me personally, I think the fact that there's so much nuance and complexity here and so much variance in how people experience all of this, I actually think that lends credibility to this entire system, because it's not putting people in boxes. It's not like, oh, you're an introvert, you hate people, you're an extrovert, you love people. That's not how it works at all. And I think extroverted thinking, you just mentioned that, or effectiveness as the preferred function for ETJs. I think it's such a great example of this, because extroverted thinking or effectiveness, and by the way, if you're new to all of this, all these cognitive functions we're mentioning, feel free to head over to personalityhacker.com and look them up on our website, because we have plenty of information about how all of this works.
Search for the CAR model. That's the best way to learn what we're talking about.
Exactly. And we've done entire episodes on each of these 8 cognitive functions. So if we're talking about extroverted thinking or effectiveness and you've not heard of that before, go check out some podcasts that we've done really kind of laying out what all of these mean. That said, in short, this is a function that feels the best and gets a chemical reward for getting things done, for making things happen, for closing loops, for managing resource and time and timelines and seeing an impact for the work that they've done and ameliorating, if at all possible. Well, that function sometimes gets real frustrated with people because people are fickle and get in the way of them getting things done. So it's not uncommon for ETJs, particularly if they were raised in a household that frustrated their attempts to make things happen, to associate people with obstacles and obstructions, and to believe that they're introverts because they don't like people, or at least they find people to be obnoxious and annoying. That said, there's also a limitation to how much you can get done without the assistance of other people. Like if you want to get something big done, that means you have to manage a large amount of resources, and that includes human resources. You have to be able to manage people. And so there are plenty of ETJs who believe that they're introverts, but the second they start getting into resource management, you can see how there's a natural talent for, and a lot of times skill developed in managing all of these things, including people. So they build social skills enough to get other people persuaded or to be able to manage them. And they're almost always, I've noticed that ETJs are a lot of times looking for systems like this to help them manage human beings. How do I understand other people? How do I understand why they're fickle? How do I understand how to get them to all cooperate to get these things done? And so the focus on people is actually a focus on resource. And that's very common. So there's plenty of ETJs out there who believe they're introverts because they don't, quote unquote, love people. They don't like small talk. They don't like having to come up with reasons to feel interested in another person's mundane day-to-day life. That doesn't have anything to do with them trying to get something accomplished, right? Those things are not that interesting to them. And so they associate that with introversion, when really the extraversion they favor is more about resources than humans, and humans are simply one resource. The other side of the aisle is for introverts, is introverted feeling or authenticity. This would be the preference for IFP types. Well, there's burgeoning information that indicates that when an IFP is listening to other people's stories, when they're hearing other people talk about their personal experiences, they go into a flow state when they're listening. Well, flow is something that we're all looking for. It feels so good to be in flow. And so if your flow state is listening to other people's stories, then that very well may compel you to go out and find people who can tell you their stories. You might identify as a very social person who really loves other people, and you're looking for these stories. Now, interestingly enough, that flow state that happens when they're listening immediately stops when the IFP comes to a decision about themselves, meaning that one of the reasons why they're listening to somebody else's story is so they can live vicariously through them, so they can ask themselves, how would I deal with that situation? What would that tell me about myself if I was in that same spot? What does that tell me about the human condition and how people go through things? And as they're noodling all of these questions out, usually there's one question about themselves that they have kind of hanging there. How do I feel about myself in this context? What do I believe about this? What is my value around this kind of thing? And the second that the IFP comes to a conclusion about that, their flow state ends. So they could be listening to a person's story and be rapt attention to the story, and then all of a sudden they lose interest and they're not sure why. And the reason why they lost interest is because they accomplished what they were trying to accomplish, which was to discover something about themselves, to figure out something, and to come to a conclusion. Now, if you're this kind of IFP, you might find yourself to be very social because you're always looking for those stories, people to tell you about themselves. So you've got extroverted thinking or effectiveness, which is the dominant or driver function for ETJs, which actually don't find people's stories that compelling. I mean, sometimes, every once in a while. But for the most part, they're just trying to get things done. And people sometimes are obstructions. So now they have this story about themselves that they don't like people, so they must be an introvert, when really they have extroverted preferences. On the other side of the aisle, you've got people who have introverted feeling or authenticity, which go into flow when they listen to somebody else's story. So they might have convinced themselves they're an extrovert because they love listening to other people and love talking to them, when really this is a way to facilitate their own introverted experience. And so the complexities of these get real layered, and I think it's important to acknowledge all of this, because if you're just looking for a list of traits to tell you whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's not going to take all this complexity into account. And I'm not trying to undermine somebody's best fit type or have, you, the listener, question everything, go, well, maybe I'm an introvert when I thought I was an extrovert, or vice versa. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're just trying to indicate that this is more complex than most people give it credit for. And if you just pare it down to socializing and your experience with other people, you're missing huge elements of how introversion and extroversion actually work.
I just want to make a really quick comment about when you said ETJs, Antonia, and extroverted thinking, and you might not like people just trying to get things done. That's an example. Please don't draw a pattern from a specific example. That's a certain type of ETJ. There are other ETJs that love people and love to serve and get needs met and are very tapped into humans around them. They're not just trying to get something accomplished in the outside world. That's not a trait of ETJs. That is a trait of some ETJs. I just want to make sure we say that, because sometimes people hear a snippet of an example and they draw a pattern and they say, oh, personality hacker Antonia Dodge said, "Oh, this is ETJs. They don't like people. They just want to get something done in the outer world." And that's not exactly accurate. That's just an example she was giving.
Well, and I'm so glad you made sure to reiterate that, because I did say if an ETJ is raised in an environment where all of their attempts are frustrated, as my disclaimer there. But I think you're right. I think people will make a pattern out of that. And there's already a lot of negative stereotypes around ETJ types, which I think are very unfair. So I'm glad you reiterated that. It's usually when they've been frustrated, right? If an ETJ is raised in an environment where people are very supportive of what they're trying to accomplish, they usually love people. Like, they love people because people help them get things done. It's when their values of getting things done are frustrated on a regular basis by other people that they create a pattern of, oh, well, you can't really rely on other people. They'll just undermine your attempts. So there's that whole component of life experience that also gets layered on top of this. It's a whole component of, well, were people around you friendly or were they hostile? That might influence how you feel about other human beings. It has nothing to do with introversion or extroversion. And so that's the other component to this, is that it might be complicated because our lives are complicated and we all have different experiences.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages of both of these, introversion and extroversion. Now that we've unpacked a little bit of the definition and maybe how to triangulate this for yourself or people in your life, there are advantages and what I would call challenges for both of these in the world. And let's start with some introverted advantages and challenges, because I think this is something that there's again a movement in the last 10 years to say, hey, I'm an introvert, I matter too, and you do. And there's a lot of benefit to being an introvert. There's a lot of benefit to someone that can take the time to ruminate on what they're understanding about the outside world within. They're going, what does this mean? And there's a lot of advantages of deep thinking that introverts can bring, I think, in a lot of environments. I think there's a lot of quietness and consistency that introverts often bring to the world. Like there's a sense of a consistency where they're not getting pulled with the extrovert world all the time. Us extroverts have a tendency to see some shiny new whatever, and we get distracted sometimes. Introverts have a tendency for focus. They have a tendency to be able to spend time in rumination and stay focused on thoughts, projects, tasks. I mean, there's a lot of benefit to this.
Yeah, and I would say that I'm a big fan of actually this introvert movement, because I think that there's been a lot of demonization of introverted behaviors. Like the trending characteristics of introversion, I think in the past were maligned and thought of as being antisocial or, something that is a mental disorder. A
problem to overcome.
Yeah, and I very much, all of the leverage work that I've done that's personal growth oriented has all been introverted work. And I developed such an appreciation of how introversion really helps us create far more rich experiences. When we're in touch with who we are, when we're in touch with elements and aspects of ourselves internally, when we know who we are, there is a lot that we can bring of ourselves to the rest of the world. And also just being able to be your own friend, being able to be okay with being alone and have that personal relationship with the self, I think it just adds so much richness to life. And so I believe that introverts have a lot of advantages actually in being able to, or, having a compulsion to go inside means that if there's stuff that's unsettled, if there are traumas that need to be addressed, if there are emotions that need to be processed, if there are beliefs that need to be reconsidered, if there are perspectives that need to be shifted, if there are things from the past that need to be really dealt with and understood, an introvert has an advantage in entering that space and dealing with dragons inside, right? The inner turmoil. And life is dramatic. Life brings its own drama. And all of that drama has to be sort of processed and understood. And we have to kind of figure out who we are in the middle of all of that. And one of the major advantages to being an introvert is the natural willingness to go inside and to look at some of those components. Now, maybe not all of those components at the same time, but a willingness to dive deep and not be afraid of those waters. And
just like you as an introvert maybe has a extroverted friend who helps you, they're like, I want to go do something, go to a social event, and you lean on your extroverted friend maybe to help with the small talk or starting off the conversations at the party or something. I think introverts can help us extroverts do the opposite in the inner world. You can be a Sherpa to show us how it's done, right? There's a way that you can help us navigate the inner terrain. Often I think introverts end up as therapists, coaches, counselors, people that can help us understand more about ourselves as humans, introverts and extroverts, not just extroverts. You can help both types of people, but I think that's a beautiful thing that introverts bring to the world. They can help us map our inner space, our inner terrain, help us get in touch with the parts of ourselves that, especially for extroverts, might be hard to slow down and really access and get in touch with. And so I think that's a beautiful gift you bring to the world.
Yeah, definitely. I've benefited from my introvert friends in ways that it's like hard to communicate the insights that I've been able to tap into. I think another advantage that introverts have, and I think we mentioned this in our Introvert Advantage podcast many years ago, is that introverts have a hard time being one-sided. I mean, there are plenty of one-sided introverts, don't get me wrong, but we have to interface with the outside world to some extent. And when you have introverted preferences, if going to an extroverted space is the nutrient, right? We call it the nutrient-dense salad. It's the place that we want to go to, that other side, that other attitude, because it makes us a more complete person. Well, it's hard to avoid the outside world, right? It pulls on us. It's constantly in our face. It's constantly reminding us of its existence. And if we have to get a job, if we, end up in a partnership, if we end up having families, all these things require us to pay attention to the outside world. And so there's a lot more encouragement for introverts to develop the other side because it's not going anywhere. It's always trying to get attention. Now, that creates a challenge of then fighting for alone time. It creates a challenge of trying to carve out that space to go inside and ruminate and get in touch with oneself again, which is a requirement for introverts to do on a regular basis. But because that outside world is always waiting for you and reminding you of its existence, there's a lot more sort of natural ecosystem encouragement for introverts to not be one-sided, to go to the other side. And so there's a tendency to be more balanced. And I appreciate that. I think that that's a major advantage that not a lot of introverts realize is an advantage, is that the world itself encourages you to grow. And now, of course, you can do it in ways that still remain one-sided, right? You can carve out a little space for yourself and then only do those things over and over and over again. And that's not particularly healthy. But again, most of the time, the world kind of nudges us to get outside of our comfort zone if at all possible. And we have to fight tooth and nail to stay in our comfort zone. And if a person is doing that, if an introvert is fighting tooth and nail to stay in a comfort zone, usually they're feeling a lot of the impacts of that. They're feeling like they don't have a lot of purpose. They don't really, have a lot of richness to life. Things are sort of mundane and humdrum, and they don't really feel like they're giving them their best self, right? They're not tapping into their best self or giving their best self to the world. And so when an introvert doesn't do the personal growth work of visiting the other side and getting outside their comfort zone, they feel those effects pretty clearly. And it's written all over their lives and all over their feelings. There's just this sense of dysthymia a lot of times. There's a lack of what, the word libido, which is that like fire for life. And so you can kind of feel that libido, that fire for life sort of diminishing. And honestly, I would say that's an advantage introverts have, is that when they're not doing the right thing, they're feeling it quickly, and it's written all over their lives. And so I personally believe that anytime we have a thermostat that gives us feedback that there is a better way out there, I believe that's a service that is done to us. And so I would chalk that up to an advantage that introverts have, even though it doesn't feel like an advantage, if it doesn't feel that great, I still believe it's an advantage.
I think another advantage that introverts can bring is this ability to not just get caught up with what the world is, the wave of the world, the flow of was it Finding Nemo, the Eastern Australian current or the East Australian current? There's this kind of current in the extroverted world that we just all kind of naturally get sucked into. And especially as extroverts, it's like, yeah, well, that's what everybody's doing. That's how the world's going. Let's just go this route. And introverts have the advantage of going, wait, how do I think about this? How do I feel about this? How do I process this? What's this mean for me? And it like is a quick little check engine light to life. It's like, wait a second, is this really where I want to go? Is this really the current I want to be in? And so it's that pause, that moment of inner check-in. I think gives you as an introvert listening an incredible advantage, because that slows things down and you don't just get caught up in things that other people get caught up in often. Now, all of us can get caught up into social movements and all these things, but I just think there's that little check right there for the introverts that I envy. I wish I had a little bit more of that. I've tried to develop it in my life, right? To check in with myself, my inner space, before I just agree to something or like, yeah, let's do it. And I think that's a really valuable aspect to being an introvert.
Now, one of the disadvantages to having introvert preferences
Challenges.
What did I say? Oh, a disadvantage. One of the challenges. Does that feel good?
I know it's semantics. I know, but it feels more empowering. I don't know. A disadvantage feels like you can't do anything with it.
All right. So one of the challenges of being an introvert or having introvert preferences is I think that there is a higher likelihood to be idealistic and sometimes even a fantasist as an introvert. If the inner world is the real world, as we described in all the ways that we described it earlier, as a reconciliation and a final arbiter, and where you feel the most real, like yourself, then whatever's gelling internally, there will be an attachment to that. And if the introvert hasn't done enough of that extroverted work to make sure they're getting outer world feedback to calibrate what's going on internally, there is a tendency to be highly idealistic. And I don't mean idealistic in like a positive way. I mean, I like living in one's ideals in a way that's detached from reality, detached from how things are actually working, holding on to something that might not be healthy, living in a fantasy, living in a space where maybe, I mean, I see this all the time with these ideals of what an introvert wants to experience in the outside world. And if it doesn't match up to the imagination or the ideal or the fantasy, then it's not acceptable. And that is a recipe for unhappiness. You know, I would say the thing or the model that comes to my mind the fastest on this is Tony Robbins' concept of disempowering rules, where he says that the most empowering rule is that you're going to have fun no matter what. But if you have all these rules for how something is supposed to go in order to feel good, you're a slave to these rules. You're now at the mercy of whether or not the outside world is going to match up with all of these rules that you've created for yourself. And when a person is idealistic or a fantasist, they have unintentionally and unconsciously created a bunch of rules of engagement. It has to look like this. It has to feel like this. It has to be like this in order for it to be acceptable. And if you don't have enough of that ballast of going, well, you know, sometimes you just don't get that. Sometimes you have to compromise or meet reality in the middle, or sort of understand that that's never going to roll out because there are limitations. If a person has too many of those rules of engagement for the outside world, then they're going to be unhappy with all of their experiences. And that is a tendency that introverts experience more than extroverts. The disadvantage is the disempowering rules of engagement with the outside world. But once an introvert lets go of those and adopts a more empowered frame, a more like, well, you know what? I get what I get in the outside world. It's a bit of a mixed bag, and I'm going to figure out how I'm going to be happy throughout all of these experiences, or I'm going to figure out how I'm going to feel more at cause in all of my experiences, then an introvert can absolutely overcome that challenge. It's not something that they are doomed to experience. It's just a tendency, and one that has to be outgrown usually.
I think another challenge introverts face, and it's a very simple concept of uncertainty in the external world, in the extroverted space. It's not even a deficiency or a problem or even a disadvantage. It's a challenge because a skill can be developed to help deal with the uncertainty you might feel in the extroverted spaces. So that's good news, but there might just be the sense of, I don't feel as certain when I'm doing extroverted things. I just don't know. Did I say the wrong thing to that person? Did I show up weird? Like INFJs will report, like, I had this conversation. I must have offended that person. Oh no. What did I say to them? And they'll ruminate for 5 years and bring it up to the person 5 years later, like, I'm so sorry I said that. And they're like, what? I don't remember that conversation. What are you talking about? It's this sense of like, I feel uncertain when I'm engaging in the outer world. And I don't think that's necessarily a challenge that can't be overcome. I think it's just something that needs to be focused on. And there can be skill developed there. And a sense of certainty can be developed over time through experience, reference experience, life experience, maturity as you grow up. and grow older, getting older in life and going through all the different stations of life, that certainty I think can be found through the experiences you have. So it can be a challenge at first, especially for a younger introvert, that I think can be overcome and developed through time.
Yeah, the key, of course, is to get outside of your comfort zone. That's always the key. That is the key to the whole enchilada. And if an introvert can train themselves to get out of their comfort zone in the outside world, they can build a lot more certainty, particularly if they're experiencing extraversion through that co-pilot or auxiliary function. That's not going to be a place of as much uncertainty, which is why it's the best stretch. Getting out of your comfort zone and into that space stretches your capacity. It sort of stretches what your comfort zone is wider and wider. And so it doesn't have to be as much of a challenge. But I would say that that's, that's all of us, right? We all have to grow up and stretch our comfort zones out. And for an introvert, that's going to be outer world territory stretching. So let's hop over to extroverts. Let's talk about extrovert advantages and some of the challenges that extroverts face.
Extroverts.
Yeah.
Those people.
Yeah. Oh, that kind.
those folks. Oh, man. Where do we start? So I think some of the advantages, obviously, for extroversion is our world, especially here in Western society, is very extroverted focused. Now, this can cause one-sidedness for an extrovert as well, right? We can get caught up in just being extroverted all the time and just getting caught up in the stream of life. But there is a sense that we have a way to navigate this space. We feel comfortable here. We have a sense of certainty. Whether we have skill developed as extroverts, we certainly feel certain in this area. We feel more comfortable here. And we feel like we're going to be okay when we're in the extroverted space. So all the requirements of life that pull on us, we're like, you know what? I got this. I'm going to be okay. Even if I don't like people, maybe as an ETJ as an example, I still feel okay in the extroverted spaces, in the extroverted world. I'll deal with it somehow. I'll figure the people thing out however I need to. But this is a world I'm comfortable in. And I think that is an advantage because there's so much of an extroverted nature to our Western society.
Yeah, I think there is a higher likelihood of even an immature extrovert having impact in the outside world. There's more of an assertive energy towards the outer world. And that doesn't mean you're assertive with people. There's still extroverts who have, say, social phobias or shyness. But there's an assertion in the world itself. There's more of a sense of having a knowingness of like putting one foot in front of another. And it's okay to engage with the outside world. It's, there's not a rolling out the red carpet feel necessarily, but there's a sense of, like you mentioned, Joel, I'll figure it out. I can probably navigate through these waters and figure it out. There's more of a self-confidence in the ability to engage with the outside world. And I think that's one of the traits that a lot of introverts envy and believe is why this is an extrovert's world. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I don't think it is ideal for extroverts because there's a lot of ways in which the world creates traps for us, and we have to be sensitive to those traps. But I do think that this idea that I can probably figure this out. I can probably like I'm not going to hold myself back from having this experience, even if it's a scary experience or something I've not experienced before. I can probably figure it out, and there's that sort of reliance on the self to figure out things in the outside world with a little bit more of an assertive energy there. And I think another advantage that extroverts have is the ability to not be as bored when engaging with boring things in the outside world, meaning that, there's a lot of extroverts who are not fans of small talk, but you can at least get through it. There's a lot of extroverts who are not fans of, rote activities at work or whatever, but you can at least get through it. There's this sense that, when I'm in the outside world and when I'm engaging with the outside world, all I have to do is turn it into a game. If I can gamify it, I can usually figure out how to, to make things more interesting. So there's also a tendency to gamify things in the outside world and not take things as seriously. When an extrovert is taking life too seriously, you've got somebody who's probably very unhappy. If they're trying to control absolutely everything, that you've got somebody who's probably got some inner work they need to attend to. But most extroverts kind of see the outside world as a little bit more of a game. Not completely. I'm not saying that extroverts don't take life seriously, but there's a sense of like, well, if it's not interesting already, I can change it to make it interesting to me. There's a sense of permission to manipulate the outside world to one's own preferences. And I think introverts hesitate to do that. I think introverts believe that they have to meet the world on its terms a little bit more, and they don't have as much permission to change things to suit them.
Well, I would say, I know we may be jumping ahead here to challenges, but this is a deep challenge for extroverts in that we do feel the external world is manipulatable. And we think that, well, if I can fix it out here, it's going to help my inner space be fixed too. We tend to want to do inner space work, and you introverts know this has to be done internally, right? Extroverts sometimes think, well, I can fix the inner parts of myself or work on the inner parts of myself or develop the inner parts of myself by changing the external systems or environment around me. And there's some truth to our environment and external systems impacting our inner world, but often it's a bypass for extroverts. We, again, try to fix something out here, and really what we need to do is turn inwardly and spend more time focused on the inner self.
Yeah, an example of this would be somebody who's always counseling everybody else's relationship problems or challenges. Like they're always giving advice to everybody else, but they themselves struggle with relationship challenges with their own partnership. And there's this idea of, it's kind of a bit of projection. It's like, well, if I, like you mentioned, Joel, if I can fix everybody out there, then somehow that will be my inner work done for me. It's a real blind spot for extroverts, by the way. This idea that the outer world is changeable is deeply empowering. But if the extrovert has not taught themselves to do their own internal work inside of themselves, if they've got dragons inside, right? We always say there be dragons. Then there will be a desire to stay in that outside world, in that comfort zone, and fix everything externally. And that's actually the biggest challenge I would say that extroverts have, is this idea that you don't have to go inside if you don't want to. If you've got unprocessed emotions, if you've got unprocessed challenges or traumas in there, it's okay. Just keep going in the outside world, and those will work themselves out, which of course doesn't happen, right? There's a whole book called Feelings Buried Alive Never Die. And the body keeps the score. It's like, hey, if you keep ignoring all this stuff internally, there will be myriad pieces of evidence all around you. And you might just reinterpret those however you want to, but that doesn't mean that inner work isn't waiting to be processed.
Yeah, there's a moment when that phrase for an extrovert becomes very real. Wherever you go, there you are. I mean, I think introverts understand that immediately. Like they just inherently know this. Extroverts, it takes us a while to go, oh, it doesn't matter what I change, no matter where I move, no matter what relationship I'm in, I'm the constant. I'm the center point of all these things. Wait, maybe it's inner work I should be doing, not just the outer changes out here. And it takes us some maturity and time to come to that realization, I think, as extroverts, to say, oh, I have to focus on the inner space and development here.
Right. That inner work is always waiting for us. And it really, that's our comfort zone stretch. For introverts, the comfort zone stretches in the outer world, and for extroverts, the comfort zone stretches in the inner world and taking in more internal terrain. And that's a place of uncertainty for us. Just like you mentioned, Joel, the outer world is a place of uncertainty for introverts. The inner world is a place of uncertainty for extroverts. And there is, I would argue there is as much a universe inside of us as there is outside of us. There is too much to explore in a single lifetime. We will die before we explore everything in our inner terrain. And to some extent, that's actually exciting because it means that we'll never run out of things to learn about ourselves. But on the other side, it means that there is almost always a ton of inner work to be done. And understanding who we are, tapping into what Jung would call whole identity, all of that lives inside of ourselves, and that willingness to spelunk inside of our souls. And that's something that extroverts have a tendency to put off. And I would say, finally, one of the advantages to being an extrovert and then simultaneously a challenge, and this goes to that whole concept of what crosses supports you and supports you crosses you. Every advantage that we have is going to simultaneously be a challenge. So we need to be observant of that and be aware of that. But extroverts, because we energy energy by engaging with our dominant or driver function, which will be an extroverted function, because of that, we usually have more energy to pour into projects and things that we're doing in the outside world. We tend to have a lot more energy. Introverts tend to tap out sooner than extroverts do and have lower energy. And they're more sensitive. Introverts are more sensitive to burnout. So when they start to feel burnout, they start resisting it. And there's less energy to manage. And because of that, they're more careful with the energy they have. And that's not to say that an introvert can't burn out. They burn out all the time. But they're usually burning out a little sooner. And they're more aware of it and tapped into it. And when they do burn out, they go do self-care for the most part. Now, there is going to be an introvert right now that's listening and going like, no, I totally burned out and then I didn't do self-care. Okay, that happens too. But the trend is that they're going to have their finger on the pulse of that more. Whereas extroverts have more energy to apply to the outside world. And so they're not going to have their finger on the pulse of it as much. If they're heading for burnout, they might not know the signs. They're not checking in with themselves internally to go, okay, how am I doing here? They're just going and going and going. So burnout is something that is worse for extroverts because when they burn out big. It is an explosion that ends up happening. And unfortunately, when you have extroverted preferences, you can even push through burnout. You can find and summon the energy to keep going until you are attempting to get blood out of a stone. So the most spectacular burnouts happen with extroverts, not introverts. And when that happens, they're not sure what to do about it. And if there's been all this unprocessed stuff that's internal, when an extrovert burns out, they almost always have a slew of unprocessed things waiting for them to sift through. And so burnouts are bigger, they're harder, they're more painful. They take a bigger hit with extroverts generally. And so all that energy is fantastic to be able to make impact and go and make things happen. But extrovert has to be very careful about not allowing themselves to get caught up in that hamster wheel and just go. And when burnout is happening, they have to keep their finger on the pulse of like, well, maybe I need to take a break. Maybe I need to give myself a little bit more space. And building skills of going inside to do the processing required in there usually is almost always a co-pilot or auxiliary tapping into, but sometimes it can be the 3-year-old, right? An extrovert is going to have an introverted function as their 3-year-old or inferior. And sometimes that's what needs processing. But regardless, an extrovert really does well if they build those skills early. Just like an introvert that goes and stretches in the outside world and gets out of their comfort zone. And the sooner they teach themselves to do that, right? Eat the salad for the soul. The earlier they teach themselves to do that, the more they realize, oh, there is areas of certainty for me in the outside world. There are a lot of really good things out here. Yeah, I can make an impact. This is all really good. I can bring who I am to the outside world, and that's awesome. When an extrovert does the same with their inner terrain, when they build processing skills, when they figure out how to go inside of themselves and connect with themselves as a true friend, and then they check in on a regular basis and don't push themselves too far outside of the red, into the red zone of burnout. If you figure out all of that stuff, well, then you can have a more sustainable system going, and you can keep making those impacts and keep having that relationship to the outside world without having a major crash looking you in the eye soon.
So what do you think? You've been listening along. Are you an extrovert? You're resonating with some of the advantages and challenges. You have some questions or comments, or maybe a story to share about your own experience, or maybe you're an introvert and you're resonating with some of the ideas we've talked about here in that inner reconciliation and the challenges that maybe you face in an extroverted world. What questions, comments, stories do you have to share? We want to hear from you. You haven't had a microphone. It's just been me and Antonia talking, but we want you to come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, leave your comment, ask your question, or more importantly, share your personal story with us.
I just want to make one real quick comment before we completely wrap up, and that is if you are relatively new to personality type theory, you can't truly understand introversion or extroversion, not really, until you get to those Jungian cognitive functions. The cognitive functions, which are the basis of the entire system, they're really what help you understand the nuanced differences between these two, between the extrovert and the introvert types. And so it's almost an intentional oversimplification so that it is accessible. Understanding introversion and extroversion is almost like an on-ramp to understand type theory. And when you get to those deeper elements, a lot of stuff becomes clear. So it gets a little confusing at first. There's a bit of a barrier of entry, but we highly recommend if you're new to type theory to really dive into those functions. And a lot of times that's what ultimately, even if it gets confusing, there's a bit of a barrier of entry to learning it all. Eventually, that is almost always a light bulb moment for a person. The insight is to whatever their dominant or driver is, and then now everything becomes clear. All right, that said, if you'd enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. Hey, you who have been listening to us for a long time and have not left a rating and review, if you would do so, I'd be very grateful. I read them all. So please go head over to iTunes and leave us a rating review or other Android platforms. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. If you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. And of course, we have a suite of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. If you are ready to invest in yourself and understand yourself at a whole new level, head over to personalityhacker.com and under our product catalog, see if there is a program that is right for you at this time period. Lots of different programs to choose from, emotional survival tools, we have body-mind practices in there, and we have just general optimization of your personality type. So head over to personalityhacker.com and check out that suite of programs.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.